I've known that I was gay and non-binary before I even knew that the queer community existed, since before kindergarten. I've heard different members of the legislature say something along the lines of parents know what's best for their kids. When it comes to the queer community, that is not true. If parents know what's best for their kids, why did my best friend get kicked out of his house and have to live with me? Why is 40% of the homeless youth queer while only making up 5% of the general population? Why do so many kids get abused for their sexuality and gender identity? A lot of you have spoken about wanting parents to know or have the ability to know what the discussion is going on in the classroom regarding queer children. If for some reason a queer kid comes out to a teacher and it turns into a discussion and the parents have the right to know that, that endangers us when we're already in danger. I held a meeting in the Queer Student Union back in December where we just talked about our experiences with homophobia and transphobia and anti-queer activity in general. Every single person in the room, every single person that I know has experienced homophobia, transphobia, either from parents or from peers or from the school. They've all struggled with mental health issues and drug abuse and family issues. Our rates of all of that are so high. I've dealt with a lot of that. So I ask you to please vote no on House Bill 1557, because as a queer minor, as a queer child with a younger gay sibling, I know that this will endanger people like me and people like my friends.
I'm Linda Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. Young children drawing pictures of their families does not seem like a fraught experience, yet new laws that won't allow for discussing sexual and gender identity in K-3 classrooms could turn this routine activity into one that is uncomfortable for some children. Today, EdCast takes a close look at what it means to engage children in open conversations on sexual orientation and gender identity, and what schools can do to be more inclusive of LGBTQ families. My guest, Dr. Abbie Goldberg, shares her expertise on creating school environments where all children feel safe, seen, and valued. Now on EdCast. Joining me today is Abbie E. Goldberg, psychology professor at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where she also serves as director of women's and gender studies. Her research examines diverse families, including LGBTQ parent and adoptive parent families, with a focus on their experiences with schools. She is the author of over 140 peer-reviewed articles and 4 books, including most recently, LGBTQ Family Building, a guide for prospective parents, and Open Adoption and Diverse Families. A frequent guest speaker, her work centers on diversity in contemporary families, the psychology of sexual orientation, gender and crime, and ethics in clinical psychology. Thank you so much for joining us today on EdCast.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Great. I want to begin with something very basic, and that is, what does the acronym LGBTQ+ stand for?
So the L, lesbian, G is gay, B is bisexual, T is trans. I had to go through, make sure I'm in order. Q is queer. And then the plus really acknowledges that there's a lot of other identities that don't necessarily fall under that simple umbrella. So that could include pansexual, folks that, maybe some people don't think of as being part of the larger community, but folks like asexual people, aromantic, intersex folks, really any other identity that might not be captured there.
Now, we know that Florida's recently approved parental rights in education would ban the teaching of sexual orientation and gender identity in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And although a Florida judge recently blocked this law as unconstitutional, it will probably reappear in some form or another in the future. So with those for and against this law, I guess the question comes up that I want to ask you in general: are laws like these protecting or are they harming children?
So we have evidence that, first of all, there's a certain number of children with, in the K through 3 age bracket that will have LGBTQ parents. Some of those kids may also ultimately identify as LGBTQ themselves. But we know that, it's not good for kids to feel inhibited to speak openly about their families and to speak openly about their identities. So, we know that these laws are harmful. And we have research from other states under other laws that show that we need to have, that kids and families really benefit when they're in an environment where they can speak openly about their families. These laws and policies put children in a really tough position. Who's to say that they can't say, draw a picture of their family or show a photo of their family, or talk about their two dads, for example. And these laws and policies make it challenging for kids and also for teachers to figure out what's appropriate. And it tells them that there's something wrong with them.
From a demographic perspective, how many LGBTQ families are there in this country? Do we know? A round figure?
We do. I do not have those numbers offhand. A wonderful source for that information is the Williams Institute. So there's many numbers that are kind of thrown out there. And again, I don't have those numbers right offhand. But, parents aside, and there's many of them, most of us have LGBT family members, right? I would argue we probably all do, whether we know it or not. And if we think we don't, maybe they don't feel comfortable telling us, or maybe we are not seeing what's in front of us. But this affects people who are beyond just folks who have LGBT parents. What about the people who have LGBT uncles or siblings or whatever?
That really answers sort of going into my next question, and that is, by not allowing these classroom conversations, you also don't have the participation of children who feel at the moment that they are not part of the LGBTQ community. And so now let's even say that they don't have relatives, but they're living in a society, where these things exist. So for them, I suppose, and you're saying these conversations are really important for all children.
Absolutely. I mean, children need to know about the different people that exist in society. They also need to know that it's perfectly, normal and acceptable if they themselves identify as LGBTQ. There's the danger that these laws and policies are actually going to foster an environment where children experience shame or stigma about themselves, or they think somehow that it's appropriate to stigmatize other children and other people in their lives because of the kind of environment that this is fostering, the belief that there's something wrong, that you shouldn't be allowed to talk about who you are, or who your family is.
You did already mention that a negative aspect of not having this conversation is a kind of shame, or, a not knowing how to handle these events in one's life at all. And I wondered if you would tell us a little about your own personal experience, because I think you experienced this firsthand in your own family. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that felt like for you.
Sure. So something that many folks don't know is that, before, coming to study these things and, doing many studies of LGBT parent families, I myself grew up with a bisexual mother. And I myself, this was in the 80s, and there was really, I wouldn't even say that being gay was stigmatized. There was just no acknowledgement in my community that somebody might have a gay or a bisexual parent. It's interesting because, now being an adult, I know of a number of LGBT parents in my community that existed, but there wasn't, to say even that there was closeting isn't really the right word. There was a sense that it was just completely invisible. So as a kid, I just didn't see my family represented anywhere, and didn't see myself reflected. So that did contribute to a silencing of some important parts of my life, which I only began to talk about, I think, once I went off to, came into high school and went off to college, and then obviously began to study these issues on my own.
There are really two key questions here, I think, and that is the classroom the right place to talk about these issues? And of course, some parents say that it is not. And if it is, let me ask you that first. How do we have these conversations in the classroom Is K through 3 too young? You know, all these things are coming up. So I'm throwing them all at you, but you can break them up, all right?
Yeah.
Is school the right place, and how do we do it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to remember that kids in kindergarten through third grade, right? So we're talking about, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. What do they understand and what do they not understand, right? So they have a general understanding at that age, usually, of basic differences between so-called, boys and girls, or male and female anatomy. Now, ideally, they also represent that people with penises and people with vaginas, that doesn't necessarily line up with people's gender identity. So that would be an important thing for them to understand, is that, many of them do believe, that boys are boys and girls are girls, but breaking apart that binary a little bit would be is very powerful for kids to know. But are these things appropriate in the classroom? Again, we're not talking, as sort of some of the rhetoric has centered on, about talking about sex and talking about sort of sexuality in a more adult way. Nobody's doing that. If you're doing that in a K through third grade classroom, if you were doing that before, you probably were already being told you probably shouldn't have those conversations. What we're talking about is we're talking about different kinds of families at that age. Kids really need to understand gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans. These are identities. These are identities that some people hold, and they're part of kind of the full fabric of our society, right? We're not talking about sex. We may be saying some people who are boys maybe get married to boys, right? And some girls might grow up and get married to girls. That's about as complex as a conversation you'd be having with a kindergartner. You wouldn't be having these kind of florid discussions around sex or sexuality. But by talking about it, you're letting a kid know that it's fine if you, for example, think you might be gay or you are trans or whatever. So it's really important at that early age to just normalize the kind of full diversity of identities that exist.
That is such an important distinction, and I really thank you for making that, because it really answers a lot of the criticisms or the concerns. Now, again, sometimes when we talk about speaking with kids about sex in general, as a parent, you always wonder when your child asks you where babies come from. I mean, so the question becomes, do you propose that we wait for children to bring these questions up in schools, or that the classroom teacher addresses them in some way prior to the child bringing it up? What does the research say on that, or what do you feel about that?
Well, I think the irony is, maybe not in kindergarten, but maybe by third grade, many kids understand the basics of reproduction. They understand, parents explain it and teachers, right? There's sperm and there's an egg and they come together and they make a baby. That's kind of what kids understand. I'm not so sure that, we should be saying teachers need to wait for kids to explain something that basic. The only thing that we're talking about that seems to be under debate isn't about saying egg and sperm make baby. It's about all the extra stuff. So is there really something wrong, or could I argue there be something really positive about adding to that little description and saying, and then some people, for example, 2 men, they have sperm, but they don't have an egg. So here's some other ways that folks build their families. Or, sometimes people choose not to or can't have a baby with a sperm and an egg. So they might do A, B, or C. They might adopt. They might, they might go to a sperm bank, which is a place where you can get sperm, right? So that's just an extension of that conversation. No one seems to be having a big problem with the basic conversation, which, of course, is the more heteronormative conversation, right? Should we be telling them that sperm and egg coming together makes a baby? It's everything else that seems to be under debate. And the whole question of whether teachers should wait for kids to ask, you know, there's risks there. Then in some ways you're giving an unequal education, because you're thinking that, you know, all kids are not coming from the same place, but yet kids deserve the same education. They all deserve to know the basics of reproduction.
There are probably parents who don't want to hear about teaching sperm and egg in
Mhm.
school either. So,
Yeah.
but these are really important points that you bring out. So let's talk about the pushback, all right? And what can schools do to address parental pushback in terms of discussing these things in the classroom?
Mhm. Well, one is to remind parents of what they're not teaching about. Again, they're not teaching about sex. Teachers aren't doing that. Um, so I think one strategy is to sort of talk to parents about the overall norms and mission of the school and how what they're doing really falls within those norms and that mission. For example, you know, we at the school, we want children to have respect for people of diverse backgrounds, and that's what we're teaching. We want to respect the right of all children to learn in an environment free from fear, right? And in order to do that, we need to make sure that our kids with gay dads or trans parents or whatever feel comfortable. And part of that is being able to speak about their family vacation in a way that doesn't force them at 8 years old to edit out the fact that they have two dads.
So going back to that idea then of making things welcoming, I know you have a website that has lots of really great information, and it addresses administrators and schools. To give us a kind of overview, what could a school do, the teacher, the administrator, to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment for LGBTQ children and families?
Yeah, I think there's so many things. They could think about what is on the website, what kinds of images and language are used. Is it truly inclusive? What do policies look like? Are they, you know, do they ensure that kids and families won't be discriminated on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation? What kind of language is used in forms? You know, mom or dad, or is there a place to say parent one, parent two, parent three, parent four? What images are in the classroom, what books, what materials, how are parents addressed, parents and caregivers, again, avoiding kind of overly gendered, which is really unnecessary language, of moms and dads, for example, which also leaves out all kinds of other types of families. I'll just note people who are being raised by folks other than their biological mothers and biological fathers.
Do you have any advice for parents helping them to advocate for their LGBTQ children? What might they do in schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes back to those two things I mentioned before related to pushback. You know, schools have an obligation to presumably educate all children and all families. And part of that involves acknowledging the existence of a diverse array of people. And all children deserve to learn in an environment where they don't have to be afraid, and they don't have to edit themselves in a way that would feel shameful or would cause them to internalize the stigma that's around them.
The proponents of the Florida law, you know, I was reading about this. Some of them said, you know, it never said that a child couldn't say that, you know, they went on vacation with their family and there were two moms or two dads. But on the other hand, you are pointing out that laws like this have a chilling effect. So to just kind of encapsulate for us, what do you see as the real drawbacks for children whose schools have laws like the proposed Florida one? Are there mental health issues that come up? I know some people say that there are. What do you think of that?
Well, it's not just what I think. I'm already gathering data from LGBT parents in Florida. I've been doing a survey for the last few months, and I have read many of those responses. And I can say what they're finding, which is that, you know, teachers and their peers, kids' peers, are responding to this in a way that is quite distressing for families. Remember that this is sending the message to kids that it's okay, for example, to tease, make fun of, isolate, give the cold shoulder to a child who is gay themselves or maybe has gay parents. So this is a sort of it's giving kind of blanket permission for a level of differentiation at the very least and discrimination at the more extreme of different groups of kids. You know, it's segregating kids into classes of, you know, better and worse, ideal and less ideal. Teachers themselves are confused. There's so much gray area, you know, in terms of the implementation of this stuff that teachers are afraid. We also haven't talked about gay teachers. You know, how are gay teachers feeling? And, you know, how can they, for example, support the gay kids in their classes, the kids who may not be out, but maybe ultimately be gay? How can they support the kids with gay parents when, in addition, they themselves may be gay, and then they may be additionally concerned about their own jobs or how this might reflect on them? These kind of very worrisome stereotypes, which are completely unfounded, of gay teachers as being somehow grooming kids. So teachers may have additional concerns about really kind of going out on a limb for families and for kids.
I read recently, talking about grooming, online hate rhetoric has really increased since the Florida proposed bill. And a lot of it focuses on the notion that LGBTQ people are grooming, and that means wanting to have relationships with children, which they would be sexually abused, accusing them of this. That seems to be the newest thing. It's horrible, but just the proposed law and the passage of that law has led to increased online hate rhetoric. So,
yeah,
I mean, I see what you're saying. It really, there's a direct link.
And I feel compelled always to remind folks that in terms of sexual abuse of children, it is not LGBT folks who we typically see in that situation. The person most likely to abuse a child is a heterosexual cisgender man, not a gay or lesbian or queer or trans person. So that rhetoric is outsized in proportion to the actual reality.
That's a very good point to bring up. So thank you for bringing that up. Let me go back then quickly to your ideal school. I usually ask my guests this, from your perspective then, what would you like to see happening in education right now that would address these concerns?
It's a great question. I mean, to me, the ideal school is a school where kids of all families and backgrounds can fully participate in their education. I did a large survey of teachers recently, and there was a participant who said, I just always think about this now, that we should never be thinking about modification. We should always be thinking about inclusion. So we never should have to modify an assignment or paperwork or an activity for a particular child or family. We should always have assignments, activities, curricula that's inclusive enough for everyone to participate without feeling that there's something wrong with them or their family. To me, that's an ideal school. And that's a wraparound kind of effort that would involve teachers and curricula and school administrators and the folks who create the websites to really enable all kids and all families to feel included.
We are running out of time, so I just want to ask you quickly then, you have a website. Can you tell us the name of that website and what people find on that website?
Yeah, so Teach All Families, www.teachallfamilies.com. It is a website that has resources for administrators, for teachers, and for LGBT parents themselves in terms of how to create and maintain LGBTQ inclusive schools, with a particular focus on inclusion of LGBTQ parent families. There's also resources for adoptive families and opportunities to learn more about the research that actually informed the development of these materials.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to appear with us today. We're out of time, but I think you have done so much to clarify misconceptions and to really underscore what's important about speaking to children honestly and openly and making every child feel valued. So thank you so much, Dr. Abbie Goldberg, for joining us today on EdCast.
Thanks so much.
Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. While opinion polls show growing support for increased teacher salaries, Education Week reports that teachers are paid less than their college-educated peers in other professions. An analysis by the nonpartisan Economic Policy Institute reports that in 2021, teachers earned 23.5% less than comparable college graduates. Teacher benefits, such as retirement plans, do not make up for this gap. Edutopia reports on new research that supports the effectiveness of play-based learning, particularly in the development of math and spatial skills. While many of us may have fond memories of playing in kindergarten, play has receded in classrooms in favor of a more academic approach to the early school years. But researchers state that learning versus play is a false dichotomy, and that learning through play has distinct benefits, including brain development. The new research points to the use of guided play, incorporating key elements of play into loosely structured lessons. ACT-FL Smart Brief reports on new teacher professional development strategies that emphasize teachers putting themselves in their students' shoes to better understand and deal with disruptive behavior. The approach, called perspective taking, borrows techniques from marriage counseling and asks teachers to imagine how their students are thinking and feeling as a means of improving classroom relationships. Some recent studies already point to the success of this methodology. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Welcome back to a new semester and our 16th year. We are hoping it is one of greater normalcy for us all. In the coming season, we'll report on what's making news in education and the way schools, students, and families are working to undo pandemic learning losses. See you next time.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your thoughts and comments to cunyedcast@gmail.com.